you're not going to have to spend very much time around computers until you start to see references to an operating system or an application being 32 or 64-bit. This is a question that comes up all the time. You'll have to deal with it in various forms on the exam. So let's talk about what exactly is the difference between 32 or 64-bit. What we're really talking about here is the number of bits, zeros or ones, that the computer can work with in chunks. And so if you just kind of picture taking your hand, reaching into a candy jar, how many pieces of candy can you pull out at once? Well, if you had a 32-bit hand, you could pull out 32 pieces of candy. If you had a 64-bit hand, you could pull out 64 bits of candy, right? Well, obviously, with 64 bits, you could move a lot of candy faster with the same amount of actions. Generally, that's what's happening with the difference between 32 or 64-bit. Up until about 2001, all CPUs were 32-bit processors, meaning they worked in 32-bit chunks. We're talking about the data width path and all sorts of technologies, 32 bits until around 2001. Then when the 64-bit CPUs or processors first appeared, CPU is Central Processing Unit, they solved a problem that most people didn't have. A 32-bit CPU or a 32-bit architecture processor can address and utilize a maximum of 4 gigabytes of RAM. Now, up until around 2001, it was very rare to find a computer that had 4 gigabytes of RAM. That was a lot of RAM for that time. A 64-bit processor can, theoretically, support up to 16 exabytes of RAM. Now you can see how fast we're moving in our technology here. We went from bytes to megabytes to gigabytes. When I say a 64-bit CPU can support up to 16 exabytes of RAM, what am I saying? Well, 1 exabyte is equivalent to 1 billion gigabytes. So we're talking about a lot more RAM. Now, as operating system and applications grew more complex, they naturally got larger and they consumed more memory. And as they got more complex, we needed them to run faster and faster and faster. Now, most people assumed back then that if a 32-bit operating system, say like Vista, ran, okay, kind of fast, then a 64-bit would be at least twice as fast. Well, that wasn't always true for all kind of reasons, but it really all kind of boiled down to the amount of memory that it could use. So as our systems and applications became more complex and more demanding, we needed more memory to power these things, and that 4 gigabyte limit became a factor. The 64-bit CPU made it possible to put 8, 10, 12, 16 gigs of RAM on a machine, especially servers, and we could run more programs more efficiently since those programs, when we open them, could all be loaded up into RAM and we weren't swapping data back and forth out of disks. Trust me, the 64-bit CPU gave us a lot more memory to work with, and we could load programs into RAM and get a lot done faster. Now, let's talk about a nomenclature that you're going to hear, and that's x86 or x64. Early 32-bit CPUs were created by Intel, and Intel gave them numerical names. There was the 8086 processor, and then there was the 8286 processor, and then there was the 8386, and then the 486. And of course, everyone was faster, shinier, newer, sexier, all that stuff. And all of these, to kind of group them all together, became known as the x86 architectures, 8086, 8286, 8386. Well, x86 architectures mean 32 bits. x64 has become synonymous with 64-bit architecture. It just simply is a way to say, okay, all these are 64-bit architecture. So you will see that out there. Just keep it in mind. Here's the big question everybody has. What about compatibility between 32 and 64-bit operating systems, applications, processors, and so forth? If you have a 32-bit operating system, it will run on either a 32 or 64-bit processor. So if you go out there and you buy a laptop or a desktop that has a 64-bit processor, you can run a 32-bit operating system on that 64-bit processor. No big deal. If you have a 32-bit application, say like a 32-bit version of Office, it will run on either a 32 or 64-bit operating system. A 64-bit application will only run on a 64-bit operating system, and a 64-bit operating system will only run on a 64-bit processor. So the bottom line is you can run 32-bit on 64, but you can't go from larger to smaller. You can't run a 64 on a 32-bit. If you can remember that, you've got it. But that's the main difference between 32 and 64-bit architectures, operating systems, and applications.